Today we're going to learn how to factor those hard trinomials, and we're going to do this using a technique called grouping. So 15.3 is the I can statement is I can factor trinomials by grouping. So let's write the word grouping right here. Okay, and we really need to be good at these little factoring riddles. So here's the first one. Find two numbers that multiply to be positive 36 and combine to be negative 13. Again, notice that I'm saying the sign even if I don't need to. So multiply to be positive 36 and combine to be negative 13. So if they're going to multiply to be a positive and combine to be a negative, they've both got to be negative. And if we were to go through, and we've done this list before, 1 and 36, can't make a 13 out of those. 2 and 18, can't make a 13 out of those. We've got 3 and 12. Let's see, that's close. We could make a 9 or a 15, so we're in the ballpark there. And then we've got a 4 and a 9. Yep, you can make a 13 out of those. And then to finish off this list, just so we've got it all there, that list would finish off with a 6. So we're going to use a 4 and a 9, but remember, if they're going to multiply to be a positive and combine to be a negative, they're both going to need to be negative. So negative 4 and negative 9. So we'll go ahead and circle that. And again, just like before, these are going to come up again, so make sure you keep track of those. Find two numbers that multiply to be negative 25 that combine to be positive 24. So 25 would go like this. We've got 1 and 25. Well, wait a minute. Those multiply to be a 25, and we could combine those to be a 24 somehow. The only other thing in that list would be 5. So 1 and 25 are going to do it. So remember, we've got a 1 and a 25 right here, but if they multiply to be a negative, one of them has got to be negative. But if they're going to combine to be a positive, the bigger one has got to be the positive one. So this is going to be a positive 25 and a negative 1. So that is our answer right here. Again, let's just double check. They multiply to be negative 25, and then if we combine them, negative 1 plus 25, that'd be positive 24. So remember, in the last section, we talked about how we can factor easy trinomials. And in this section, we're going to do the hard trinomials. And again, remember the difference. Easy ones have a coefficient in front that's just a 1. Hard trinomials have a coefficient in front that's not a 1. It's something other than that, a 2, a 5, a negative 15, whatever it happens to be. So with factoring trinomials that are the hard type, we're going to use grouping. So this is going to be called the grouping method, and here's how it works. So this is a hard trinomial, this is trinomial grouping. So here's what we do. We multiply the leading coefficient with the constant term. So we take the leading coefficient right here and we multiply it by the constant term. Now we include the signs when we're multiplying, and we only use the coefficient. We do not use the variable. That's not included. And what we're going to do is we're going to write that number off to the side. So the number in front here, the coefficient is a 6, the constant is a 6, so we multiply those together and we get a 36. I'm going to write that off to the side. So I wrote it off to the right-hand side, just like this. And I'm going to go ahead and put a dotted circle around it. Okay, so it says find two numbers that multiply to be the number in step number 1. So I need two numbers that multiply to be 36 that combine to be 13. So multiply to be positive 36 and combine to be negative 13. Let's say that the same way. So multiply to be positive 36, combine to be negative 13. So those two numbers are these guys right here. We already answered this. So I'm going to write those down. I'm going to write down negative 4 and negative 9. Now, when you write those down here, we're going to do the next step, which is rewrite the middle term using those two numbers found in step number 2. So I'm off to the side here. I'm just going to write down 6x squared. I'm writing this as two separate pieces. So I'm going to write minus 4x, because it's got to have an x on it, and then minus 9x, and then I'm going to write the plus 6 on the end there. Now, here's what we've done. We found two numbers that multiply to be positive 36 that combine to be that middle one, and then I took this and I broke it up into two pieces. So using those two numbers that answered that riddle, I'm going to write down the negative 13x as a minus 4x and a minus 9x. All right, so all I've done here is I've rewritten the first one. There's our 6x squared. I've written the last one, there's the plus 6, and I've rewritten this one so that it's written with a minus 4x and a minus 9x. It's still the same thing, it still represents negative 13, but now if you look at this, now I can go through, and this has 4 terms, now we can do factor by grouping. Okay, so we finish this off by factor by grouping. So a couple of sections ago we did this. So we're going to group the first two together and then the last two together. So what can I take out of a 6x squared and a 4x, a minus 4x? Well, I can take out a 2 and I can take out an x. So what I'm left with is I'm left with a 3 from the 6 and I'm left with 1x from that x squared. I took out a 2 out of a negative 4, so that's a negative 2, and I took out the x, so there's nothing else left there. And now I turn my attention to this one right here. I need to take something out of a negative 9x plus a 6. Well, because that's negative, I'm going to take out a negative. Remember, we worked on this before. Make sure you write down that sign right there. And out of a 9 and a 6, we can take out a 3. Now, we can't take out any variables because this one doesn't have a variable. It's just a constant. So if I take out a negative and a 3 out of a negative 9x, I'm left with 3x. And if I take a negative out of a positive, I'm left with a negative. Remember, it changes the sign there. And I'm left with, let's see, if I take out a 3 out of a 6, I'm left with a 2. Okay? Now, look at this. We've got two terms here, and they have a common factor. I'm going to highlight this like I did before. So those two are exactly the same thing. So I'm going to write down that I've got a 3x minus 2. I'm going to take that out, and then I'm going to write down what's left. So what's left of this first one is a 2x, and what's left of this last one is a minus 3. And we circle that, and we are done. Now, there is a little bit of guess and check involved here in order to get these numbers. But if this has an answer and we do the rest of this right, we know that we're going to get this correct. This problem right here is really a hassle if you use any other method. You can do it without using this grouping, but it turns out to be pretty tricky. Now, here's a very common question. Most common question is, does it matter what order I write these down in? Well, just like we said before when we were doing easy trinomials, it wouldn't matter if we wrote down a negative 9x here and a minus 4x here, as long as we took the sign with it. Okay, which isn't a problem here because they're both negative. So make sure you're careful with that. If I had written a negative 9x here and a minus 4x here, I would still get the same answer down there. Okay? All right, so I want to make sure. Remember, we can always double check in step number 2. If they're correct, you're going to get the right factors as long as you're careful. Now, if there are no numbers that work in step number 2, then the polynomial is prime. So I'm going to write the word prime right here. Okay? Now, what that means is it can't be factored, okay? Now, the fact that we ended up with an answer to this riddle means that we could do this and we knew that we were going to get this right. Same thing is true on this next one. So we take the coefficient right here and the constant at the end. We multiply these together. We end up with negative 25. I'm going to put a dotted circle around that. Now, what we're doing is we're finding numbers that multiply to be this one and multiply to be that one. So we need numbers that multiply to be negative 25 and combine to be positive 24. Well, just like I said before, it's a problem from the warm-up. So that's going to be negative 1 and positive 25. So I'm going to write negative 1 and positive 25. So in order to make this one a little more clear, I'm going to zoom in on this and show you how I typically go through doing these. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write down the 5x squared. I just write that down again. And then I rewrite this one using those two numbers. So I'm going to write down a minus 1x, and then I'm going to write plus 25 and an x, and then I write down the minus 5. So notice this one comes down here, this one comes down here, and I break this one into two numbers, two terms, using those numbers that were the answer to the riddle there. Okay? So now I look at the two of these, and then I look at the two of these. So this is why we call this trinomial grouping. We're turning this trinomial into four terms so that we can use our grouping technique. So what can we take out of a 5x squared and a minus 1x? Well, we can take out an x, and we're left with a 5 and only one x left. And if we take out an x, we're left with a minus 1. Now, you'll notice that I didn't have to write that on there. I could have just written a minus x. If I did that, then I'd have to remember, oh, yeah, there's always a 1 left. So if you want to write it there, that's great. If you don't, that's fine with me. Then we're going to take out the leading sign. So we're going to take out a positive. Please don't forget that. And out of a 25x and a minus 5, we can take out a 5. So I can take out a 5. If I take a 5 out of a 25x, I'm left with a 5x. If I take a 5 out of a 5, I'm left with a 1, but remember that's a negative. So now notice what we've got here. Those two are the same. So I'm going to highlight this again. So we've got a 5x minus 1 that I can take out of both of them. And then I just write down what's left of this one when I take out the 5x minus 1. What's left is an x, and what's left here is a 5. We circle that, and we're all set to go. Now, if you wanted to, I'm going to do this once. So I'm going to change colors, and I'm going to multiply these together. So we can always multiply these together and see if we get the original problem. So I'm going to multiply the 5x times x, 5x squared. The 5x times 5, 25x. The negative 1 times x, that's negative x. And the negative 1 times 5, that's negative 5. Those two are like terms, and let's see, we get 5x squared, we get plus 24x, and then we get minus 5. So that right there is the original problem, so we know we got this right. This checks out. Okay, so I'm going to go back to full size here, and we multiply those together. We know we've got it right, so we're in good shape there. So here are the rules. Number one, always take out the GCF. That's always going to make our work easier. If there are 3 terms, and this is what we worked on yesterday and today, if it's the easy type, we use that guess and check riddle method. If it's the hard type, then we use trinomial grouping. Okay, that's what we're learning today, this highlight in red. If there's more than 3 terms, then we group them together and we find the GCF within the terms, so we use that grouping technique. And we always want to factor completely. Always factor completely, and don't forget to include all the factors in the final answer. So I'm going to flip the page over here, and let's take a look at a few more examples. So we're on the back side, and the instructions are the same: factor each polynomial or state that it is prime. We may have some here that turn out to be prime, so let's take a look. So we're going to do the coefficient times the constant. We multiply those two together, and we get 60. Now we need some numbers that multiply to be 60 that combine to be negative 19. So if I did 1 and 60, can't make a 19 out of those. 2 and 30, can't make a 19 out of those. 3 and 20, 3 goes into 60 20 times, can't make a 19, but we're close. And a 4 and a 15. You can make a 19 out of those. Now just for the heck of it, I'm going to finish this off. 5 and 12. And 6 and 10. My gosh, 60 is a tough one. Look how many factors there are there. We're going to use the 4 and the 15. So I'm going to put a 4 here and a 15 there. Remember, they need to multiply to be a positive and combine to be a negative. So in order to multiply to be a positive and combine to be a negative, they've both got to be negative. Now, I just rewrite the 2 of these. So I'm going to bring down the 6t squared. I'm going to write it there. I'm going to write minus 4t. I'm going to write minus 15t. And then I'm going to write plus 10. So again, if you wanted to write the negative 15t first, that would be fine, and write the minus 4t second, that's okay. The only thing that's going to be different is your factors are going to turn out to be in a different order, which is totally okay. So let's take a look at this one. We're going to take something out of a 6t squared and a minus 4t. We're going to take out a 2 and a t. We're left with a 3t, and when you take a 2t out of a negative 4t, you're left with a negative 2, so we're done with that one. Notice that this starts off with a negative, so I'm not even going to look at these terms or numbers until I write that negative down right here. And then I've got a 15t and a 10, so what I can take out is a 5. So we're taking out a negative 5. So if you take out the negative and a 5, you're left with a 3t. And if you take a negative out of a positive, that's going to turn that to negative, and a 10 divided by 5 is a 2. And this is going to happen every time. Remember, we said if you get the right answer to this one and you do everything else right, you're going to get the right answer. If this doesn't have an answer, then it's going to be prime. So here's what we get. We've got 3t minus 2 in each one of them, and I'm left with a 2t from this one. I'm left with a minus 5 from this one. Circle that and we've got our answer. Again, you could multiply them together. I'm not going to take the time to do that on this one because we've done that several times already. So let's take a look at this one here. So on B, we've got a 2 and we've got a 9. So we're going to take that 2 and multiply it by 9. We get an 18. So we need some numbers that multiply to be positive 18 that combine to be positive 9. So multiply to be positive 18, combine to be positive 9. So again, we could write down a 1 and an 18, a 2 and a 9, and a 3 and a 6. So that's all of them. But if you want to make a 9, you're going to use the 3 and the 6. So 3 and 6. Now, they need to multiply to be positive 18. They need to combine to be positive 9. So they're both going to be positive. Okay? So again, I'm just going to write down the 2x squared. I'm going to rewrite this using these two numbers. So I'm going to write plus 3x plus 6x. Again, that represents 9. It just looks different. We've written it as two separate terms rather than one. And then plus the 9 right here. So as long as this had an answer, we're going to get this right. So we're going to group these two together, then these two. So what can I take out of a 2x squared and a, let's see what we've got here, a 3x? The best you can do is take out an x. Doesn't touch the numbers at all. So we get 2x plus 3 here. What can you take out of a 6x and a 9? Well, they've both got a 3 here. And remember, we want to take out that sign, so I'm going to write a positive right there. So we take out a 3. And if I take a 3 out of a 6, I'm left with a 2. Didn't touch the x at all. Take a 3 out of a 9, you're left with a 3. So notice that they both have a 2x plus 3. So we're going to write that out front. And then we save this set of parentheses for what's left. If you take out the 2x plus 3, you're left with an x. Take out the 2x plus 3, you're left with a 3. Circle that and you've got your answer. So hopefully, this takes a little bit of getting used to, but hopefully you're getting pretty good at this. So I'm going to multiply the two of these together. That's going to be negative 36. I need some numbers that multiply to be negative 36 that combine to be positive 5. Now hopefully you're getting pretty good at this. Numbers that multiply to be 36, this comes up a lot. So we could list down all the factors, but remember 4 and 9, that's probably the most common numbers that people would use for 36. Those will multiply to be 36, and we can make a 5 out of those, but remember, we've got to make a positive 5, and when they multiply, they've got to be negative. So the rule on this one is, if they have to combine to be a positive, the bigger one's got to be positive. So this is going to be positive 9 and negative 4. Now, before we do anything else, let's double check and make sure. Do they multiply to be negative 36? Yes, they do. Do they combine to be positive 5? Yes, they do. So negative 4 times positive 9 is negative 36. Negative 4 plus 9 would be positive 5. We're in good shape. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write down 4x squared. I'm going to write this down in two separate pieces, minus 4x and then positive 9x, and then I'm going to write the minus 9 right there. Okay, let's go for it. So grouping here, we group the first two together. I can take out a 4 and an x. I'm left with an x, and if I take everything out of there, if I take a 4x out of a 4x, I'm left with a 1, but remember that's going to be negative. And what can I take out of a 9x and a 9? I can take out, again, the sign there's positive. I'm going to take out a 9, so we're left with an x and a negative 1. So I've got an x minus 1 here and an x minus 1 there. So we take out an x minus 1, we're left with a 4x plus 9. Now, the only thing that would be different if you wrote these in the other order, if you wrote the 9x right here and then the minus 4x right here, the 4x would come first, 4x plus 9 would come first, and the x minus 1 would come second. It doesn't make any difference. Totally okay way to factor that one. So I'm going to go back to full screen here, and I'm going to slide this down. Now, I've got asterisks by each one of these, okay? So let's be careful with these, and let's take a look at this first one. So on this one, we're going to multiply these two numbers together, the 3 times the 7. So again, it's the coefficient times the constant. Coefficient out front times the constant on the end. And again, the signs are included, but not the variables. So this is going to be 21. I need some numbers that multiply to be 21 and combine to be 2, positive 2. So 1 and 21. You can't make a 2 out of those. Let's see, 2 doesn't go in there. 3 goes in there 7 times. We probably already know that one. You can't make a 2 out of a 3 and a 7. Let's see, is there anything else that goes into 21? 4 doesn't, 5 doesn't, 6 doesn't, nope. So none of these pairs, no matter how we paired these up, there is no answer to this riddle. No answer to the riddle. So if there's no answer to that riddle, then this is prime, okay? Now, please make sure that before you say it's prime, you go back and you double check. Do I actually have all the factors written down here? Is there anything I'm missing that would multiply to be 21? If this really has no answer, then you can automatically say that that's prime. Okay, we'll slide over to this one and we'll take a look here. The first rule in factoring is take out the GCF. Now, none of the other ones have had a GCF, but this one does, because notice we've got a 3 and we've got a 9 and we've got a negative 120. The fact that this is such a big number kind of clues us in that maybe we ought to pull out a GCF and see if we can make this smaller. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take out a 3. We're left with a y squared. We're left with a 3y, and then we're left with, let's see, we took out a 3. That's still going to be negative. 120 divided by 3 is 40, okay? So let's see, are there any numbers that we could get to multiply to be negative 40 that would combine to be negative 3? Well, let's check and see here. So a 1 and a 40. Nope. A 2 and a 20. Nope, those won't make a 3. A 3 doesn't go into 40. A 4. So 4 goes in there 10 times. Well, that makes a 6, so we're getting kind of close. Let's see, 5 goes in there 8 times. Okay, so 5 and 8. Hey, they multiply to be a 40, and somehow we could put together a 5 and 8 to make a 3. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off a set of parentheses, because really we've got an easy trinomial here. So I'm going to do a y and a y. And I need the 5 and the 8. Okay, so 5 and 8. They need to multiply to be a negative and combine to be a negative. Multiply to be a negative and combine to be a negative. Again, the rule is if they have to combine to be a negative, the biggest one's going to be a negative. That means the other one's going to be positive. So let's just double check here. Do these multiply to be negative 40? Yes, they do. Do they combine to be a negative 3? Yes, they do. So we got this right. Now, I'm going to circle that, but remember that 3 was a GCF, so we need to pull that out. So make sure that you're following all those rules, especially rule number 1 and rule number 4. So let's take a look at this last one. And if you think about it, this trinomial grouping actually works on the easy ones as well. So watch how this works. I can multiply 1 times 40. So 1 times 40 is 40. I've got this same list that I had over here, and I want to make a 14. Well, if I want to make a 14, I'm going to use a 4 and a 10. So I'm going to put a 4 here, and I'm going to put a 10 right here. Now, they need to multiply to be positive 40 and combine to be negative 14. So that means they're both going to be negative. So watch, I'm going to rewrite this. P squared, I'm going to write this down in 2 pieces, minus 4p minus 10p, and then plus 40. So again, the constant at the end just comes down here, the squared term just comes down here, and then this breaks into 2 pieces. So I've used those 2 numbers that solved my riddle right here, and then let's take a look. What can I take out of a p squared and a minus 4p? We can take out a p, and we'd be left with a p minus 4. Yep. Okay, we're going to take out a negative, and let's see, I've got a negative 10p plus a 40. 10 and 40, I can take out a 10, so we're going to take out a negative 10. We're left with a p from this one, and if we take out a negative, that changes the sign of that one. So that's going to be a negative, and 40 divided by 10 is 4. So we've got a p minus 4 and a p minus 10. Now, that is the right answer, but think about how much easier it would have been if we just did it the easy way. Since that starts off with a 1, I know I've got a p and a p, and I need numbers that multiply to be positive 40 combined to be negative 14. I'm going to put a negative 4 here, and I'm going to put a negative 10 right here. That is a million times simpler, okay? So that is called trinomial grouping. That's the technique. Again, always take out the GCF, and then if there are 3 terms, you want to figure out, is it a easy one or a hard one? If it's an easy one, piece of cake. Do it the easy way. Just answer that riddle right there. If it's a hard one, then we do this trinomial grouping technique. So go ahead and do the self-assessment here, and then good luck on the assignment.